Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the beginning of our fall speaker series here at the Civitas Institute. I'm Ryan Streeter, the executive director here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to today's lecture, which is Constitution Day. And we're pleased to have Dr. Marc Landy here to deliver our talk on this great day. Dr. Landy is a professor of political science at Boston College, the author of several books and the winner of numerous awards. Also the faculty chair of the Boston College Irish Institute. And among his books are Presidential Greatness and the Environmental Protection Agency, Asking the Wrong Questions from Nixon to Clinton. And pertinent to today, just this past March, his book came out called Keeping the Republic, A Defense of American Constitutionalism, which we look forward to hearing more about today. His full bio is on the website, and I'd like to turn this over to him so we can get going. So if you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Marc Landy to the Civitas Institute.
It's so great to be here. I have former students and friends, and also not former friends, current friends here as well. It's an enormous pleasure, and this, I think, tennis, you guys are turning into something really great, and what you and the others are doing across the country in North Carolina and Florida, Ohio, Arizona. It's just the most exciting thing happening in higher education. So I congratulate you. Okay. The Constitution is, oh no, I ruined my own intro. I won't bang the thing again. The Constitution is broken and should not be reclaimed. This headline from a New York Times editorial written by two law professors from Harvard and Yale is simply a more hyperbolic expression of a point of view that has become increasingly prominent in the writings of law professors, journalists, political scientists, and politicians who deem the Constitution to be not only broken, but paralyzing, undemocratic, obsolete. The latest to join this chorus is the Dean of the University of California, Berkeley Law School, Chermaninsky, whose new book is subtitled How the Constitution Threatens America. These critics abhor such non-democratic constitutional elements as the Electoral College, the Senate, the amendment process, the presidential veto, and although this is not, and the lifetime appointment of Supreme Court justices. But underlying these complaints is a deeper critique of the spirit of the Constitution and of the massive republic which it founded. That spirit, indeed America itself, is said to be inherently undemocratic, excessively individualistic, greedy, inegalitarian, and corrupt. Because the nation's founders indulged but did not endorse, this is, of course, they don't quite get this extraordinary distinction, indulged but did not endorse the institution of slavery, the Constitution itself is often said to be an instrument of racism. It is also insufficiently protective of rights, and because it is so difficult to amend, it forces the living to be governed by the dead. And that's actually Jefferson started that little routine. The Constitution was designed to reconcile liberty with an effective and therefore energetic government. The two major threats to liberty were national government oppression and tyranny of a national majority. To prevent government authoritarianism, the framers sought to limit the power of central government. Article 1 enumerates what power the government, the Congress, may exercise, and it may exercise no other. That's what the Constitution says. The separation of powers and the checks and balances provide an institutional relationship designed to protect those limits. Limited government, that's the big idea. But arguably the most important check of all was the great residual power retained by the states. Today we tend to view the Bill of Rights as being devoted to protecting the liberty of minorities, which it does. but as the very excellent Yale does have some good law professors. Akhil Reed Amar has astutely observed, the 10 Amendments originally applied only to the federal government, trusting the states to be better guardians of liberty than a distant central government. Further, check on agentry. I'm not sure that if I didn't adequately define that term, but I will. Was provided by the great power the Constitution vested in the people themselves. All criminal cases and civil cases involving more than a mere $20, even in those days, well, it wasn't such a huge sum, call for trial by jury. Thus, 12 ordinary people have more power to determine the outcome of a trial than does the judge himself. There's a whole context here for understanding the Constitution of the enormous effort it makes at limitation. Thus, the Constitution exists to cope with the problem of agentry. Now I'll use that term. All that agentry means is that although we are free to choose our representatives and indirectly choose the president, we have precious little control over them in the interim between elections. I mean, this was the anti-federalists, one of their big complaints. You send these people away in those days, it would have been to Philadelphia, and they're going to do what they want to do. Particularly those senators who are there 6 years. What kind of leverage do we have? Re-election. Well, but you know, that's a long way off, and as we see at the moment, subject to all kinds of strange vagaries. Right? Those people are there. They can do what they want. Though they did not anticipate the fourth branch of government, right? All the unelected agency commissioners, agency heads, subheads, all the regulatory agencies that we live with, all the huge military, the Pentagon bureaucracy. I mean, it's vast. They didn't anticipate that. That would give them too much credit. But the checks on government power that they put in place remain the best means for curbing this form of agentry as well. But it's not just agentry that's the problem. It is equally critical, as the framers recognized, to prevent tyranny not only by the agents of government, but by the tyranny of our worst selves, the tyranny of the majority. Today's most vociferous constitutional critics think that Americans should be a majoritarian democracy rather than the mitigated democracy the Constitution creates. Critics imply that if all the obstacles to majority rule the Constitution establishes were removed, the American people would just be freer, more egalitarian, probably have better voices, sing better. I don't know what else it would promise, but that the obstacle, what unites the criticism is that the obstacle to better government is checks on the majority. They're, as disparate as this crowd can be, that's one thing they all agree on. Simple answer is no. The Constitution mitigates democracy, not because it wishes to oppose popular rule, but because it seeks to discipline popular rule by imposing restraint. It erects hurdles, not barriers, for the majority to overcome. It constrains democracy in order to discourage impulsive democracy, the notion that majorities should obtain their goals in real time. I have to say, I have a wonderful co-author, Dennis Hale, as our book, Keeping the Republic, Defense of American Constitutionalism, demonstrates. Virulent attacks on the Constitution are not confined to contemporary legal scholars, journalists, etc. They date back as far as the Anti-Federalists and are present in the writings of such critical voices as Henry David Thoreau, William Lloyd Garrison, Edward Bellamy, Herbert Croly, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, in somewhat more complicated way, Franklin Roosevelt, who in other venues I'm often defending, but he wasn't a great constitutionalist. And the New Left thinkers who emerged in the 1960s. The central argument that we make is that the Constitution provides for a free government because it places effective limits on the national government and on tyranny of the majority as well. That the people should rule is a given. That evanescent public opinion should rule in real time is preposterous. The limits that the Constitution places on American political life are not a problem, but a response to a problem. That problem is the difficulty, even the danger of popular government in a massive modern state. The United States was the first large modern state. Well, maybe France was, but so the United States was the second large modern state, but the first one that really took the idea of Republican government seriously. And it was the first to, with all due respect for the French, it was the first to seriously confront the challenges that such an enterprise poses for Republican government. The problem posed by the modern state, in which we all, not just Americans, but people, what is now the dominant form of political organization in much of the world, not all of it. The problems posed by the modern state stem from modernity itself as a way of thinking and being in the world. The American constitutional framework embodied and hopefully still somewhat embodies a measured and wise response to those problems that were there at the time, and it remains the best framework for coping with the problems modernity poses for America today. The framers understood many of those problems, those that modernity brings with it. They thought very carefully about how to deal with those problems, how to embrace modernity without simply embracing it in order to tame it. The following are the most politically relevant attributes of modernity. In a modern state, no person can, without fear of ridicule, claim to be better than another as a matter of birth. It took the United States a long time to get serious about that idea in many ways, but the idea was there from the beginning. Equality is the rule. In the public sphere, rank does not have its privileges. Of course, in the private sphere, it can. Claims of superiority are only considered valid if they are based on a rational principle, merit. Of course, equality and merit are often honored in the breach, but such hypocrisy does not undermine the compelling nature of such claims. The modern state is enormous in scale. It's true that there are also some small states, but those exist at the sufferance of the larger ones. They could easily be conquered by the big guys anytime they wanted to. The U.S. is not Switzerland. Before the modern period, large political entities were empires rather than nations, and they lacked the level of political integration, stable borders, and administrative control that modern states enjoy. Scale means not just acreage, but people, and large populations are more important even than large territories in creating difficulties. It is inevitable that the vast populations of modern states will bring diversity with them, right? For an American, that's obvious. But of course, the only modern state really that is homogeneous is Japan. They have other kinds of problems, but once you say Japan, I defy you to look at a modern state, large modern state, that's not diverse. And many of them are much more diverse than they used to be. When polities were small, right? This is an educated audience. You know about the Greeks. I've got better people in the room to teach you about the Greeks, but just to make the simple point that all the citizens, that direct rule by the people was at least possible. All the citizens of Athens or my beloved New England towns could gather in one place and deliberate among themselves as to how to address issues of common concern. Because their numbers were small, citizens had the chance to speak and be heard. Yet because the modern state numbers in the tens or hundreds of millions, direct participation is impossible except for a small fraction, office holders and an activist fringe, and lobbyists. Each citizen comes to compose an infinitesimal fraction of the whole, right? That's the worst news. Does your vote count? Maybe this time in Pennsylvania, maybe. My vote doesn't count in Massachusetts. I hazard to say that some of you, you're feeling that your votes won't count in Texas. Well, that's just the way it is, right? Not only does this place practical limits on direct participation, but it also makes it very difficult to resist the conclusion that any one individual is simply too significant to matter politically. It's the worst news I have to bring you today. And therefore, one may readily become passive because all modern states claim to rule in the name of the people. Right? I'm saying that this is in a way a bogus claim. Right? Name and the rule of the people. Those who belong to it are called citizens, not subjects, as they would be called in a monarchy. And yet arithmetic reality threatens to turn them into subjects, in fact, if not in name. Thus, the claim of popular sovereignty does not per se protect against autocratic rule. In modern states, populations are not only large and diverse, they're highly mobile. Indeed, states like Brazil, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, that lack many of the attributes of modernity. Well, Brazil doesn't so much, but India not so much. But anyway, they don't have all the attributes that I'm describing, but they have extraordinary rates of movement from rural areas to the cities. Right? The rural areas are being depopulated. There are cities in China that I've never heard of that have many millions of people. I mean, that's partly my fault, but I suspect some of you might suffer from the same vice. And these and other poor countries have also contributed to high rates of global mobility by migrating in large numbers to the more fully modern states of Western Europe, Britain, Canada, and the United States. As a result of both international and internal migration, whole new communities and neighborhoods have arisen, and their inhabitants have not yet put down strong roots and continue to live among strangers. I'm giving this talk in Austin, Texas. I think I don't have to hammer that point. The long human era when most people lived and died not very far from where they and their ancestors were born is pretty much over. I mean, it exists, but it doesn't dominate. To ensure peace and security, modern states must command and mobilize huge militaries. I know that that's a controversial point I'm making, and yet I make it wholeheartedly. Right? The state of your military presence is largely dominated by what your foes are doing. Right? The voluntarism exists in some ways only at the margin. The 20th century became the most violent and destructive in human history. The government that is strong enough to protect the people is strong enough to tyrannize them as well, right? That's what Madison and his buddies understood. Modern history is replete with examples of leaders using their armies and national police forces to terrorize the population or punish their opponents. and of generals ordering their troops to turn their guns on elected governments and to replace those governments with a military dictatorship. Napoleon and Mao were generals before becoming tyrants. Hitler and Stalin established powerful armies and apparatuses of civilian control capable of creating vast empires, repressing dissent, and indulging in the mass murder of millions of their own people as well as of the people they conquered. What the sad history reveals that in addition to the other challenges posed by modernity, modern states are dangerous. The quest for material well-being and longer lives ensures that the fruit of modern science and technology would be aimed at providing prosperity, longevity, and physical well-being, as well as military capability. As a result, the vast majority of people in a modern state will be wealthier than human beings have ever been, except for the tiniest minority. Middle-class Americans enjoy a material abundance unknown even to the pre-modern aristocracy. Unfortunately, as Hobbes foresaw, and everything I know about Hobbes I learned from that guy, well-being does not breed contentment. As citizens' more immediate wants are satisfied, new desires emerge. I mean, think of it. People didn't even know about cell phones, and now they're just considered, and everybody has them. When I say everybody, I mean pretty much everybody has them. And what do we want next? I don't know the future. As productive capacity increases, citizens become less content with their current levels of consumption. When Samuel Gompers, if that's a new name to you, you should know who Samuel Gompers is. He was the first president of the American Federation of Labor. And when he was asked what the American worker wanted, they looked at it. It's a silly question. More. I mean, I would have loved to see the look on his face when that question was asked. He was right. Modern citizens do not want merely enough. They expect the pie to grow larger forever and for their own shares to grow as well. Thus, the more government accomplishes in providing for people's wants, the more the people pressure it to do even better. The ever-expanding demand to provide for human welfare complements the need for security to make government ever more powerful and intrusive. And as advances are made in nutrition, sanitation, medical science, people in modern states live much longer. Look at me. And infant and child mortality declines. Populations will therefore grow, contributing to the problems caused by size. Okay. Since they were crafting a constitution for what was clearly a modern state, the American framers gave great credence to reason, science, and universality. They were deeply influenced by his friend Hobbes and the great liberal philosophers who came after him, especially Locke, Montesquieu, and Hume. The Federalist more frequently quotes Hume and Montesquieu, the Federalist Papers, but the incorporation of seminal ideas such as natural rights, consent, the primacy of security for life and liberty in a state owe a great debt to John Locke. I'm sure you're all reading John Locke, so I'm not worried. The framers prided themselves on being enlightened and on freeing America from the shackles of feudalism and of founding, in Madison's words, a new political science. As Lincoln later stressed, they considered the self-evident rights enunciated in the Declaration of Independence as the unstated premise on which the Constitution itself was based. That is a controversial idea, but Lincoln said it, right? The Declaration is the apple of gold and the Constitution is the silver frame. So if Lincoln said it, it's true. And this is crucially where our path, their path, diverged from the French, because they did not aspire to transform human beings. or human nature itself. They accepted human nature as it was because they understood that human nature cannot be changed. However, they diverged from Hobbes by not claiming that human nature consists of nothing but the interplay of passions. They sought to devise a form of government that both relied on a pre-modern understanding of human virtue and sought to compensate for, rather than extirpate, human failings. The great statement is in Federalist 51, right? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But men are not angels and could not be made so. There's a single, I think, great insight that they had. I mean, here, the French Revolution happens pretty quickly in the wake of the American. But on this key point, the revolutionaries diverged. Right? The French Revolution is all about changing everything, the names of the months, the length of the week, how you tell time. There is nothing left unturned until, of course, it was overthrown. But that's not my subject. Right? They realized that men were passionate, self-interested, and prone to forming factions. They desired power. They were also virtuous, thoughtful, and public-spirited, but not reliably so. Right? That's the dilemma. To succeed, government would have to adapt to this ambivalent reality. The framers built upon human virtues and sought to check human foibles. They allowed pre-modern qualities of human life to coexist with modern ones. Humans could aspire to knowledge and progress even as they clung to religion, custom, and other quote-unquote non-rational beliefs and practices. Yeah, that's the glory of limited government. It leaves room for things that matter to us all a great deal, right? That can only be achieved locally. If that sounds like it's de Tocqueville, it's because everything I know I learned from de Tocqueville. So that's just the truth. Okay, the Constitution established a granular structure designed to promote deliberation, consensus, and public participation without surrendering the values of stability, energy, and legitimacy. Conceding, by the way, that such a government might be sometimes slow to act. Right? This is behind so much of the critique of the Constitution. We're slow, right? There are hurdles to be overcome. And there really is a cost-benefit calculation here. My friends who don't like my argument always say, yeah, but then we're not going to get this, we need that. The public needs all these marvelous things. I say, yes, if they're that important, the hurdles will be overcome. If those hurdles aren't overcome, probably means they're not that important. Additionally, the Constitution supposes that there are some things a national government can do well and some things it can't, and therefore should not attempt. Some things, that is, are best left to levels of government closer to the problem at hand. To use the simplest example of what the framers, I think, would have meant, the federal government is demonstrably better at sending people into space than it is at improving math and reading scores in local elementary schools, high schools, wherever you look, right? I mean, unbelievable trillions that have been spent by the federal government on improving public education. And where are we? It is well to remember that government can and must remain energetic, but it can and should do so without undermining those constitutional arrangements that have made popular representative government possible in the world's second largest democracy. The difficulty develops when judicial and bureaucratic excesses and congressional inattention cause problems to be attacked with methods that distort constitutional forms and principles. This is our dilemma. Not that the Constitution is wrong, but that its essential understandings are being undermined. Not only do those distortions threaten our liberty, but they are often ineffective as well, and therefore sap government of the energy and tax revenue, as well as the public confidence it needs in order to govern legitimately. Okay. But this defense that I've been making, right, and it's full-throated, right, it raises an important question. If the political order the Constitution provides is so excellent, why has confidence in the constitutional design declined in modern times? I mean, scratch a pollster and he or she will show you trust in government, legitimacy of government, effectiveness of government, down the drain. And does this decline have something to do with I said that. To further complicate the issue, the low level of trust, which has descended into the teens, coexists with strong public support for the notion that the federal government should do even more to improve the lives of the people, often in the form of what Sidney Milkus has called programmatic rights, meaning not rights that we enjoy against government, but rights that we believe government has to provide for us, right? Social Security, Medicare in particular, and then claims are made, right, for a right to clean environment. You name it, a right has been declared in its favor. As my teacher, James Q. Wilson, astutely observed, the traditional, what he called legitimacy barrier has been broken in modern times. The citizenry and its elected representatives no longer ask two questions about a proposed policy, right? The two questions would be, is it a good idea, right? You're not going to do it if it's counterproductive. And is it constitutional? These days, they only ask the former. Right? You hear this from Congress people all the time, right? Oh, I like this policy. Let's pass it. Well, if it's unconstitutional, the Supreme Court will take care of that. I mean, this is a kind of abdication of responsibility that just is unspeakable. The legitimacy barrier's decline has a long history, dating at least as far back as the contempt that T.R. and Woodrow Wilson had for the document. A seminal anti-constitutional thinker was Herbert Crowley, who you should read, even though he can't write worth a dime, but he may be the seminal thinker in the anti-constitutional movement of the 20th and 21st centuries. Crowley had a great influence on TR. In the book, we follow this key anti-constitutional thread through the New Deal and the Great Society, although we are not entirely hostile to either the New Deal, certainly not to much of the New Deal and even to the best moments of the Great Society, the civil rights laws. The book concludes with an examination of public policy making since the late 60s. In order to solve the mystery of how robust progressive policy expansion continued post-1968, even in the absence of reliable progressive majorities in Congress, that really doesn't start till '94, and the frequency with which Republican, ostensibly non-progressive presidents were elected, right? The Republicans came back to life, and yet the trends that I'm trying to describe have not been reversed. Public policy continues to frequently go against the constitutional grain, even though the Democratic Party dominance of our politics that really existed from 1930 to 1968 at least. From 68 to 220, Republicans held the presidency for more years than the Democrats. I think now Biden pushes the needle a little bit toward the Democrats. God knows what will happen this time. Republicans have held the presidency for more years than the Democrats, and divided government has dominated the Congress, and yet no serious retrenchment has taken place. The key to solving this mystery is to recognize how key aspects of modern policymaking work to hide the true costs and the practical import of what the government is actually doing. Contemporary American government is unusually opaque, conducted largely out of sight and driven by legislation that is more often than not exceedingly long, detailed, and therefore increasingly difficult for even the most well-informed citizens or for congressmen to understand. To make one comparison, the Wagner Act, one of the real jewels of the New Deal, which created, in a way, created the modern labor movement. If you don't like the modern labor movement, you can hate the Wagner Act, but it certainly was consequential. 8 pages. The Affordable Care Act of 2009, 906 pages long. And as a very astute student of modern government, Krista Muth has argued, the real price tag of expansionary American public policy is greatly understated by 2 forms of what he calls tax evasion. One form is regulatory policy making, and the other form is deficit spending. Due to the amassing of huge deficits that will only be paid by future generations, the public does not see the true cost of ever more expensive federal programs. And thus, it is all the more willing to ignore the breakdown of legitimacy barrier. This isn't costing us anything. This is especially true for the many citizens whose incomes do not generate any federal income tax at all, right? I think the media just vastly underestimates the number of people who are qualify for the for the federal income tax credit and actually get money back from the government and pay no taxes. By the way, I don't think that's a bad idea, but it certainly doesn't give those people a great incentive to be terribly concerned about the costs of public policy. The public has the mistaken impression that expansion is coming free of charge because the government doesn't pay for it in real time by raising everyone's taxes, but defers payment to the future through the mechanism of debt finance. It borrows money by selling bonds, taking advantage of the fact that global investors, especially the Chinese and the Saudis, consider the United States to be a solid credit risk. Whatever our other foibles, we seem to be a good bet for the future. But eventually these bonds will have to be redeemed, which means that Americans are trading current pain for pain imposed on their children and grandchildren. As of 2024, the federal debt was $35.27 trillion, that's with a T, dollars, the highest in the nation's history, and not only in peacetime, it surpasses the debt incurred to pay for the Second World War. And yet both presidential candidates are advocating programs that would further expand. I mean, they leapfrog. I want to save that metaphor of leapfrog, right? They're outbidding each other. What can we do to make people even more comfortable, and who cares about the cost? And then a more subtle thing than deficit spending is federal regulatory policy, which hides the true cost of expensive programs, whether to clean the air or worker safety or opportunity for the disabled, things that I think I approve of. I can't speak for you guys. These are, I think, laudable objectives. But the taxpayer doesn't pay for them, right? The costs of these programs are shifted to either the private sector or state and local governments. The federal government pursues several ambitious and expensive goals via regulation, as I mentioned. However, since the private sector can, for the most part, pass along the costs of compliance to consumers, the public pays via higher prices but doesn't know how much it's paying, or even that it's actually footing the bill for these noble regulatory aims. The other crucial means of hiding what the government is doing is what my wonderful colleague Shep Melnick calls leapfrogging. He invented the term. Leapfrogging occurs when either a court or an agency expands the agency's regulatory power. That can come through court cases or come through initiatives from agencies. Congress, and with very, very unconvincing explanations of how these added powers are provided in statute. I mean, in our book, we really give you a number of examples where you read the statute, and a great example is affirmative action. The 64 Civil Rights Act and all subsequent revisions of it do not call for affirmative action. And yet since LBJ in 66, the government still is largely committed to affirmative action. Affirmative action might be a good idea, but I don't want to be told that by the Office of Civil Rights and the federal courts. Okay, so agency ups the ante, the court approves of it and ups the ante more, which allows the agency to even up the ante even more. Congress could, of course, intervene. I'll get back to that in a minute, but it doesn't. Originally devised as a means to prevent the Nixon administration from retreating from Great Society goals, leapfrogging soon outgrew its initial partisan purpose. It has now become standard operating procedure during Democratic as well as Republican administrations, as agency officials have come to treasure it as a means for implementing policy that might otherwise prove unpopular if they had to pass Congress and be exposed to the glare of publicity. Thus, the stealthiness of debt financing and policymaking via regulation is it's a wonderful word, exacerbated by the successful efforts to avoid public scrutiny. Leapfrogging has been rampant in such policy domains as civil rights, environment, higher education, special education, aid to the regulations protecting the disabled, etc. Of course, the public supports racial and gender equality. Right? You want to call members of the public hypocritical, knock yourself out. But the point is that in opinion poll after opinion poll, anytime you ask the broad public whether they believe in these goals, the public says yes. Better schools, environmental quality, and aid for the physically and mentally disabled. But due to the opaque interactions of courts and bureaucrats, it has no clear window, the public has no clear window into how these policies are actually implemented, or even what the policies are. So it falls to Congress to bring the invisible government into the light of day and curb it. Right? I think the framers were pretty much unanimous that the great engine of curbing the excesses of the other branches of government was not the Supreme Court, it was Congress. Yet Congress has abdicated its duty as a statutory guardian, ignoring the persistent habit of leapfrogging that circumvents the letter of the law. Its members have become so enamored of proclaiming their partisan proclivities. I love this term, virtue signaling. If you ask Tip O'Neill what virtue signaling meant, or Sam Rayburn, they just would have looked at you, what the hell are you talking about? that they have neglected the hard work of framing statutes, debating their merits, curbing the courts, and overseeing policy implementation. As a modern state, the United States will inevitably take on a wide variety of tasks, and those charged with performing those tasks will just as inevitably seek to maximize their discretion in doing so. Right? That comes, A, because it means you can justify your existence if you're doing good stuff. And it also satisfies, I think, the moral principles of the government agents are not bad guys. I hope you don't come away with that message. From the New Deal until very recently, the bureaucracy acquired a powerful ally in the judiciary. Now, however, the Supreme Court has taken some significant steps to take has taken significant steps to keep administrative frogs' legs on the ground. But Congress remains the key to maintaining the democratic accountability of the executive branch. This is not really ultimately a court matter. Mindful of the possibility that federal officials might be less than faithful to their assigned roles, the framers created Congress as the key countervailing power, expecting that the ambitions of its members would drive them to fight against executive and judicial aggrandizement. The future of the republic rests on the willingness of Congress to reassert that noble ambition. Thank you. I love questions, so whatever's on your mind.
We will now take questions.
Sir.
Do you see, in the contemporary climate and extreme partisanship, any chance that the states become more active in opposing and limiting federal government?
Yeah.
And I could see that going both ways. So the way that certain states oppose Trump and others might oppose.
Federalism is, I think, a really great bulwark of decent government. And partly that means that states will diverge significantly. But that goes back to what I said about modernity. The public is very diverse. They're not as diverse geographically as they are if you look at it as a national. I mean, I spend a lot of time in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There are no conservatives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They just, if they are, they hide under in cellars somewhere. And I suspect in some nearer to you where you guys live, the same could be said for liberals. What?
There's Harvey.
There's Harvey. That's an insider remark. Ignore it. But states have to be given that to retain that kind of leverage. They still have an awful lot of power. There was a long period in which that power was constricted, and now I think there's something of a trend in the other. And you'll get some terrible government out of it, right? Because there are 50 states. There's always Rhode Island. And but it's a great safety valve, and also means that states can do interesting things. Look at you guys. Look at this place. Congress didn't create a civic leadership institute, right? The state of Texas did. My blue state, Massachusetts, isn't going to do it. Well, so what? So that's too bad. Too bad for Massachusetts. So you see the direction of my thing. Federalism, I think, is a great bulwark of positiveness.
Hey, thanks very much. Dr. Landy, thanks for the comments and the perspective. I would, Robert Douthit, Man About Town, I would argue that your vote counts. It just doesn't maybe make it past the state level when it comes to the presidential election. The votes always count. They just don't get to count all the way up through the Electoral College. I'd like your perspective. I'm a 20-year Army veteran. I've deployed all over the world. I've lived in Germany for 3 years and been in technology for subsequently 14 years after that. So in this broad-based sort of experience of life, having watched both parties in the United States spend more money than we have, if you could look at sort of the historical perspective on first the interpretation that we could spend money that we don't have, and then what implications that has today for the future with maybe a national debt larger than the defense budget.
The implications are quite dreadful, right? At some point, the Saudis and the Saudis and the Chinese are going to want some of their money back, right? I mean, this is, I think, not entirely sustainable. That's one problem, is that when you have when you're in debt, your loans can be called. And there's one scary thought. Another is just the simple burden that debt service places on the federal government. I mean, we really could be spending more money on intelligent things if we didn't have to pay so much debt service. I should have a number for you, but I don't off the top of my head. And it's, well, we're in the place we'll see this first. It's a slightly different example, is Medicare. Medicare financially is simply not sustainable. It isn't. And I think what that will mean, because it's not, I don't think the country is going to go bankrupt. I think you and I might not be around to see it, but most of the people in this room probably will. There's going to be some kind of onerous surtax to pay the debtors. I mean, sorry, to pay the creditors. The debtors are not good at paying. So I think it's going to be a very bad moment. I think, you know, we'll survive it, because people will have to pony up, and but it's pretty dreadful. And you know, as a person with grandchildren, I'm very unhappy about it. Yeah.
Thank you. So thinking about a couple of the ways in which the founders tried to slow down popular opinion and filter it, one would be the Electoral College, but even before that, the effort to have the president chosen by state legislatures, and the other being, sorry, okay, I'm sorry.
No, senators were chosen by
okay, thank you.
Not president's the Electoral College.
Right, right. But the electors, well, I think there was a hope for more filtering to happen there. More filtering of public opinion to happen there. And now we simply have the situation where the majority can vote for one person and somebody else can win. And that's undermining our trust. And then the other is the bicameralism, with all of the ways that Congress slows things down. And instead of having more deliberation, we have less deliberation because things don't even come to committee. And so what would you say to the challenge that the founders were looking for institutional mechanisms for solving a problem that's not fundamentally institutional, but a matter of morals and character and patriotism, and relied on that too much?
They counted on something that it turns out you can't entirely count upon. These cultural changes are very troubling. But I wish that the intelligentsia would kind of own up to that, instead of picking all these stupid fights about, you know, packing the court and so-called election reform, which to my mind doesn't add up to a lot of reform. So, but once we, well, you know, your question is, in other words, profound. And I, you know, I just somehow have to hope that if the federal government maintains a certain state of limitation, that at the local level, in churches and neighborhoods and cities and counties, that people start to talk to each other better. In other words, I'm not saying that I'm raising the most profound problem we face. It's just one that Dennis and I could write a book about. I don't have any great wisdom about cultural improvement, but well, no, here you are. You know, the best thing that has happened in moving in the direction that I want to move in perhaps in my whole lifetime are you guys in Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Arizona. Hopefully there'll be others. Things have to start from the grassroots. Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned the anti-federalists at the beginning, and I wanted to make an anti-federalist question here. I mean, one of the main things that they're concerned about is that they think that the federal government will become too large and it'll be too centralized. But isn't that kind of the truth of the matter? Isn't that, and then that's some of the things that you sort of are concerned about it. I mean, the tendency of it is to become too centralized. And so is that, a failing of the Constitution, or is that something that takes place, later on after the Civil War amendments? Obviously, it becomes more centralized, and then later on, the way in which the court interprets things.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
What do I want to say? It's a very good question. It's always the first refuge of the scoundrel. You praise the question, so you get a little more time to think. The Constitution really set up impressive barriers to centralized government. And the trouble was that they haven't been entirely maintained. And it's tough, right? The toughest part is delay, right? I mean, the great spokespeople for changing the Constitution they're in a hurry. We have a lot of ills in the society. By the way, most of those ills the federal government can't fix, but that's a different argument. That's a substantive argument. But just procedurally, things are going to go kind of slow. And that really frustrates people. I mean, you just look what campaigns are about, right? About how we're going to do more for you. There's a kind of natural human instinct to want more done for you. So it's very tough. I just don't think we can lay it on the document or the institutional arrangements themselves, except when they've been perverted at certain points by the judiciary, which has a very checkered history over from being absurdly conservative to being, to my mind, impossibly progressive. It goes both ways. The judiciary hasn't always behaved that well. Presidents, on the whole, presidents haven't aggrandized in any kind of crazy way, but they're always expanding. Let's do. I think of Lyndon Baines Johnson. So I'm sort of talking around your question because I don't have a great answer for you, to be honest. It's a real problem. It's kind of like your question. I mean, you're going to levels that I don't think simple talking about institutional design can solve. Our book is really pretty limited to those problems that arise from a misunderstanding of institutional design. We're political scientists, but we don't pretend to be sociologists or, theologians.
I have a less profound question for you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk. I was struck when you said that the modern state tends to be diverse, because one could say that modern states are the opposite, that they impose a kind of homogeneity on populations. To choose, I like that expression, to choose a non-controversial example, what about the first modern state, France, that you said? I mean, we can all think of what it means to be French. That's where the state of France is. Seems fairly homogeneous. There's some variation, I would say. The United States is outstanding in some respects.
Yeah,
but there's something homogenizing about the modern state and the imposition of statehood. Yes, fuzzy at the margins,
I'm
but...
going to accuse you, Alexander, of anachronism. Okay. Do you look at France today, England today, Germany today? My God, these places their problems exceed ours. How about that for an outrageous statement? Right? I mean, what really is Germany going to do about the fact that its population is so divided, not racially and ethnically, but culturally, philosophically.
Couldn't you say that's from the decay of statehood?
That's what?
From the decay of statehood in those places.
Yeah, you could say that. But then the question is, yeah, I would say that, in fact. I think, yeah, yes. It's a decay of statehood, but it's not based on their constitutions. It's based on some just dreadful decision-making by some very supposedly famous statesmen and women. Don't get me started on Merkel.
This will be the last question.
If you want to take this question very broadly, I just want you to talk about patriotism. But I'm going to try to make that a little more concrete so that you have something to work with, right? So the American founders, as I would talk, and this is something that I could say, the background of this question is I think about this a lot when I teach classes on American politics, what it means to be a patriot, what students need to learn about their country if they're going to be good citizens, whether it's my responsibility as a teacher to somehow cultivate patriotism or whether it's important to simply be objective and just tell the story without feeling one way or another about it. So I guess what I want to ask is this, whether there's something in our situation as contemporaries, right? Not just as moderns in the sense of, living within the world of modern liberal political philosophy, but as contemporaries that's particularly inimical to old-fashioned patriotism, whether our sense of, maybe this is related to Alex's question, our sense of our nationhood has diminished somehow, and whether that's important, right? Whether patriotism is something that we need. But again, I just kind of want to hear your thoughts broadly on the topic.
Let me give you a short answer and then struggle with a longer one. So the short answer is yes. And the decline of patriotism is a very strange thing. And I used to share so my building at BC is there's a lane, and on the other side of the lane is the ed school. And all you have to do is look at the posters they put up, right? Those who are responsible for teaching those who will then teach children don't believe in patriotism, and they always think patriotism is just a excuse for various forms of prejudice or discrimination or evasion of something good. And how that happened, I think the ed schools are a big part of the story. And I don't know the whole story of why. I don't think ed schools were ever much good, right? Teachers learn by being apprenticed. So much for ed schools. But I don't think they had such directionality as they do now. They really preponderantly seem to see their responsibility as making sure that young people learn about every foible of American life, of which there are many, right? But that's their choice. They're not being objective. Let's throw that word. Try to be dispassionate, impartial, but you're never going to be objective. But can you really teach students about the history of this country and not talk about patriotism? How many died in the Civil War? How many died in the Second World War? We'll leave the First World War out of it. I'm not sure I totally on board with that, but patriotism, it's just, you can't live without it. I like the fact that in Texas, all the buildings, so many of the buildings they have the United States flag and the Texas flag. We don't do that in Massachusetts. We usually have no flag, or maybe the EU flag, or and we certainly don't have a Massachusetts. We're a great Commonwealth, and we are still a great Commonwealth, but does anybody talk about it? No, you're onto something. And again, reform is so difficult. right? Because then you're always verging on, impinging on freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. I mean, how do you tell a teacher you can't teach that garbage? That's troubling. I'm not so ready to do it. So I don't. Well, again, the trend of the questioning is toward questions I can't answer. But I do peg it to the ed schools. And the whole way, early, what children learn in school is often quite poisonous. Right? I mean, the idea that, well, I won't go into all my illustrative examples, pick your own.
Thank you all for attending this lecture, and thank you, Professor Landy.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. I really appreciate it.